just part of the deal. And I've got it on record now, and I'm going to put it on speaker view. And we'll go ahead and get ourselves going here. And go ahead and mute. And I think that, well, we've got about 25 of you now, so that's about, we've got a few more who will join us, but it's good to see everybody. It's good to see that you're getting on and getting ready. I guess we're getting really good at this. we're learning to I guess to navigate this change in our lives, this technology in our lives, a lot more comfortably than we used to. So it's time for us to begin, and I don't want to delay any time, but there's that one announcement that we are still pursuing getting back on campus with our Bible study, but we will, regardless of going back or when we go back, Lord willing, we'll continue with Zoom. We have added so many people who are out of state or out of town, and we need to have that still open so that as many of people who have started with reading through God's Word with us can continue. And that seems to work out. It's getting more comfortable for all of us. So I guess that's a good thing. And I think it's a blessing of the Lord. And I really think we ought to continue it. So that is our plan right now, and still have the recordings, which will, as we go through, be posted on the YouTube site that you can access just by using my name. They're beginning to be up there, and if you and we have people joining almost every week, not quite, but almost every week. So if you want to go back and see or follow some of the earlier weeks, they're available for you there. So I don't know that we have any. Oh, there's one more thing. Angela needs, she's working with Kim to arrange for childcare for the time when we will be able to be on campus. And she just needs to know, Kim will need to know how many children there will be. So each mom needs to tell me how many of her children would need childcare, the preschool and nursery, and then their ages, because Kim has to hire the people who will do the childcare according to our needs. If there's only 1 or 2 children, that may limit us with the availability of childcare. So we just need to know if that's something that you would benefit from. It is really a gift from Indian Rocks to have childcare for our moms who are in Bible study. So I do want us to take advantage of that opportunity if we're able to have it. So there are a lot of things we need to put on our prayer list in our nation, in our state, in our church, in our families, in our own lives. All of these things, I'm going to begin with asking our blessing from the Lord on our time here together. And I ask you, Lord, to open our hearts to your Spirit and your careful teaching of the things that you have revealed through the life of David and his kingdom, and the events that we read about this week in the book of 2 Samuel, and of course all those marvelous Psalms that you inspired to be written to express how the Lord how you were working in David's heart and in the heart of the people of Israel and in his kingdom that is instructive to us even today as we can apply these things to our own lives in so many ways. Thank you for teaching us even the difficult things, and that we can know, because we have seen your work and your work faithfully all through the ages, that we can rely on you and your presence in our lives and your power and your strength and your love, your mercy, your grace, your faithfulness. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for all of these promises that you've given us. Ask your blessing on us as we search and study your scriptures. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, let's take a look now at, we begin in week 19 with chapter 13, which is sort of the beginning, or you pick up again the story because it begins with "some time has passed." So to make sure we are all on the same page and the context is there, let's just recall from last week, 2 Samuel, the 12th chapter, the previous chapter, describes the events that will unfold in chapters 13 through 23 that we have this week to look at. Because this is the unfolding of the events that were told to David through Nathan, the prophet Nathan, as a response to David's sin. And so let me just go back and kind of review in chapter 12. There are several verses, but if you look through there, the Lord told Nathan to tell David, this is the list of indictments, if you will. These are the counts that are against you, that I'm bringing, the Lord is bringing against you. And the first one is, David, you are guilty of several sins, not just one, but several. And you are, first of all, guilty of being ungrateful for everything that I've done for you. This is beginning in the 7th verse of chapter 12. You're ungrateful. And he outlines all the things that the Lord has done for David in his life from the beginning, from the time he was anointed. You have forgotten me. That was his first indictment, which is really quite stunning when you think about only a few chapters earlier, he was on the top of the mountain as far as the blessings from the Lord, and he had been given the covenant that his kingdom and his throne in Jerusalem would survive forever. The next indictment that we read about is, you have despised my commandments and acted as though you're above the law. He's primarily looking at the morality issues, the moral issues that are brought up in God's commandments of adultery. He lists the broken laws as coveting, adultery, bearing false witness, and murder. All of those things were spelled out in the things that David had done and have been recorded in Scripture. So that is the indictment. Those are the list of indictments. Part of this was also the thought that you had gotten away with it, that your sin had not penetrated your consciousness enough to realize how you have sinned against me and what that's going to cost. And so then he, in chapter 12 as well, the Lord pronounces the judgment that he has given because of these indictments that have been brought, these counts of indictments. There are some judgments. And the first is you will not be killed because of this. Now, the law that was spelled out in Exodus and Leviticus and in Numbers, there are several places, and Deuteronomy, where it is said, if you are guilty of adultery, which is one of the things that David was primarily, if you're guilty of adultery, both the man and the woman have to be stoned to death. Apparently, God is not requiring this, and so he tells Nathan that David will not be stoned to death or Bathsheba because of the sin of adultery. And the next thing is, he says, the sword, or another way of saying it, the violence will not depart from your household. That means your dynasty. For the rest of time, perhaps, there's going to be conflict and violence and sin and disobedience and all the things that you've done. It's not going to depart from your household. And another judgment is you will pay fourfold for the ewe lamb, which was the picture of Bathsheba being taken. You're going to pay fourfold for the lamb that you took, which means you will lose 4 of your sons. And that's what plays out. In chapter 12, we see that the baby of that product of that first encounter with Bathsheba, that baby dies. So that's the first of the fourfold consequence. The next judgment is, I will raise up evil from your house, and it will be public, is the last thing that he says in these verses. God tells him, I will raise up the evil in your house, and that evil that is in your house will be public, and everyone in Israel will see this evil and know what you have done. And this begins then the valley that follows, or the wilderness, or the valley of shame, or however you want to say it, which it begins to unfold. And we read about that in these chapters in 2 Samuel. You might note that we do not have any corresponding chapters in First Chronicles about this time like we did in with the other things in David's life. I think that's quite interesting that the later historical records that were given for Israel did not include that. So if we didn't have these passages in 2 Samuel, we would know about these things. And so I wanted to begin sort of with some time has passed. So we know that David's reign was 40 years. It began in 1010 BC, 7.5 were in Hebron. He, in 1003, comes to Jerusalem and begins his reign from Jerusalem. It is about 992 or so when Bathsheba comes to David, and so it makes it about 991 that we see Solomon being born. And but at this time, Amnon, who is the eldest son of David, Amnon was born in Hebron, and he's the firstborn son of David, so that would make him the crown prince. And as far as David knows, he has not been told anything different that we see in Scripture. As far as he knows, Amnon would be the prince that would become king upon David's death. So he is the crown prince. And we see the events that are beginning to unfold in chapter 13 that involve the eldest son, the firstborn son, Amnon of David, and his wife, his mother, the Amnon's son, was one of the wives, many wives of David that is listed there for us in Scripture. I want to sort of preface this because this whole section of Scripture really is brought home to bear with the Apostle Paul's discussion in Galatians chapter 6, and in verse 7 when he says, "Be not deceived. God will not be mocked. Whatever you sow, you will also reap." And this begins that whole understanding that we have of the law of reaping and sowing and reaping, which we will get to even more a little later on. But let me just pause here because this is what is unfolding. The reaping of what David sowed. And so we have to look at, that's why I wanted to read those indictments to say that's the seeds that David sowed, which he is now reaping in his life. And we'll see that it involves other people's lives. And I listed many of them, some like almost 30 of them on your handout that I sent out, because there's so many, that cast of characters, there's so many that is involved in this process. I wanted to kind of detail them out. Some of them bear heavy consequences associated with David, and some, of course, bear their own consequences, and which is true of all of us. But that whole principle of God's sowing and reaping has been throughout all of Scripture. And it is a physical law as well as it is a spiritual law. It's a law of creation, of cause and effect. We always know that a consequence will follow a choice. Now, sometimes the consequence is a good one. Sometimes it's not a good one. But there will be a consequence for every choice that we make, or deed, or action. And the action consciously taken is the deed that is sown. So we make a choice and have taken action, and that is the deed that is sown. And in the case of David, for instance, he planted the seed of desire and ultimately carried through with the seed of adultery, which he planted, and the outcome of that seed is now being brought. The consequence of that decision that he made and that choice that he made is now being brought in David's life. This is a design of God. It's a created design of God in nature and in spiritual law as well, as I've said. And these intentional acts, either good or bad, are what we sow. And then we can see what grows from that deed. And we will be judged by those deeds that we do. And we need to understand that as well. There are many scriptures that talk about that we're going to appear, for instance, 2 Corinthians 5:10, for we all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed or paid for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So this has eternal consequences, not just consequences in our lives, and it's not just consequences in our own lives. It affects others' lives in our life. And to look a little bit deeper into this, whatever one sows, that is what they reap. If you plant corn seed, you're going to reap corn. It is a cause and effect always reliable reaction of the physical laws of nature. If you plant a bean seed, you're going to get a bean plant. So whatever it is you sow, that's what you reap. So if you reap immorality, immorality and the effects of immorality is what we reap. Sometimes we think we won't reap exactly what we sow or what we meant to sow, or we think of it, maybe I won't get exactly what I sow, and we fool ourselves. But the text doesn't say that. It says, not what we meant to sow, it's not what we thought we sowed, not what we tried to sow, it's what we did sow. We reap the deeds that we have sown, and it's an awesome thing. It's an awesome thing to realize that that is a fact of our lives, and we have to learn that. And I think that these lessons in this week have been given to us so that we have that lesson. But I don't want to end there, because I don't end this thought in our opening thought, is because there's always a but God in Scripture. And I'm so thankful for that. And in Romans 5:8, we have, but God commended his love toward us in that while we were sinners, we were in the thick of the problems that we have reaped in our own lives because of our sin. Born in sin and living in sin, we are sinners, and that is what we reap. And because of God's love toward us, he pulls us out of that sin by his death and burial and resurrection. If we just admit our sin and ask him to forgive us of our sin. But let's go back now to the unfolding of the story. With that in mind, the sword has entered David's household. The judgments that have been pronounced that we've just read have begun to unfold, and it's, we have to read it as a relentless torrent of crises, disasters, calamities, shame, sorrow, utter catastrophe. And it lasts pretty much the last 20 years of David's reign. So these chapters occur in about 12, maybe 15 years. So the last little bit may be not quite so, and we'll see those next week, may not be quite so sad or disastrous, but they still have the same effect. So we begin with the shame of Amnon. Amnon lusted for his half-sister Tamar, and you read those. I'm not going to go through each one of those, but he's the first one to fall in this scenario that unfolds here as the sword has entered David's household. We find out that this was lust and not anything else, this man, and we need to realize that these are men now. Amnon had been born first back in 1010. We're at least at 1087, or excuse me, 987, which would make him about 27, maybe, something like that. These are adult men. These are not children. These are not teenagers. So we don't need to think of it that way. Tamar probably was a bit younger, quite a bit younger, but she was at least a teenager, maybe even a late teenager. And he saw her, his half-sister, whom he knew he had no rights to, but he lusted after her. He then is, Satan sends into this household, which is part of the sword, Jonadab, who is one of David's sister's children, make him a nephew of David. Jonadab starts seeing an opportunity, and we don't know if it's hatred for David or jealousy for David, but he undermines David by going and giving really bad, wicked, actually, advice to Amnon. Amnon carries through this advice, this intrigue that is set up by Jonadab, and ultimately rapes Tamar. Tamar, her life is now ruined from now on, and so we see the consequence of someone else's sin on an innocent life. And that's the horrible thing about sin. It just doesn't seem to have too many limits. But revenge enters again when Tamar, who is now hated by Amnon, there was no sympathy, there is no repentance, there's no contrition, there's only hate in Amnon's heart. And that's what his half-brother, who is Tamar's full brother, Absalom, who is the second-born son of David, also born in Hebron, also an adult man by now, in his 20s. Absalom sees this, and he begins to bear revenge against Amnon, and he also bears resentment and perhaps even hatred against his own father, because he was not satisfied with how David dealt with the sin of Amnon and the destruction of Tamar's life. Absalom didn't like how it was handled, and he wanted to take revenge for himself. We are given a timeline, which I gave you sort of an overview in your handout, so that you can see that time goes by. There's not a quick reaction, and that often happens in the story of intrigue and revenge and resentment and deceit and all of those things that happens. It's not a reflex. It is a considered kind of a response. And so the bottom line is Absalom figures out a way to kill Amnon in a situation where he may not be held responsible, or at least he'll have a chance to get away. Again, Jonadab comes in and is involved in the deceit and so forth. At first, David is told that when the sons were all away on a sheep herding and sheep shearing time, that all the sons were killed, but that is not true. But Absalom's rebellious spirit and pride is there for the rest of his life. He is an immature and selfish and jealous person, and he sows destruction, which will last for at least 10 years, maybe longer. But the bottom line is all the sons are not killed. Only Amnon is dead. So now this is the second of the 4 sons that David will lose. David grieves the loss of his son, but he moves on. And now the crown prince is Absalom. And Absalom, the crown prince, has had to flee for his life because he is afraid that David, and it would be correct, that David would have him killed because of him murdering his half-brother Amnon. So he goes to his mother's place up in Geshur, and that's where he stays, and he's gone for about 3 years, it says. Then we move on to chapter 14, and apparently things are going pretty rough in the kingdom, and with David, things are not settled because the king wanted Absalom to come home. He longed to have Absalom home. He had finished grieving, it says in the end of chapter 13, he had finished grieving over Amnon's death, and he wanted his son Absalom, the crown prince, to come home. He wanted that assurance, I guess. Well, Joab tried to arrange it. I just think it's so interesting that people that have been brought into this situation, we are now introduced to a woman from Tekoa who is a widow. I think we need to pay attention to how positively these women in this story are addressed and how the story is repeated and told, which involves these women. Many of these women are portrayed as helpful and useful and peacemakers, and not objects of derision or any of those things. It really is quite remarkable how these women are portrayed. So Joab, who's of course the head of the armies of the kingdom under David, he is trying to make the king's mind more settled, because Joab is figuring if the king is settled, then the kingdom will be settled, and that's really what Joab needs to have happen. The kingdom is not settled. There is tension, there is uncertainty, and things are not in good shape. So he tries to enlist this woman, but he can't go to the king himself, so he enlists this woman of Tekoa, and then he gives her instructions about exactly what to say, and he uses the idea of using a story about somebody else that David would be perceptive enough to recognize as maybe involving himself. And that's how it turns out. And we do need to look through in chapter 14, verse 13, the woman asks, because she has gone to the king and asked permission to speak to him. And she is reported that some people are out to kill her son. And so in 13, she begins to unfold the story that touches David's heart in such a way that he recognizes that this is how the Lord is going to deal with him. The woman said, "Why have you devised something similar against the people of God? When the king spoke as he did about this matter, he has pronounced his own guilt. The king has not brought back his own banished one." That obviously the whole kingdom knew about Absalom, and that that was the source of the tension in the kingdom. Verse 14, "We will certainly die and be like water poured out on the ground, which can't be recovered. But God would not take away a life. He would devise plans so that the banished one from him does not remain banished." This is quite a remarkable statement. It tells a lot of insight of a plain woman who is a widow from Tekoa. She recognizes a lot about who God is and how he works. And it reminds us of 2 Peter 3:9. "The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, but is patient and not willing that any should perish." He sees that there is an opportunity with God for redemption. There should be an opportunity in David's heart for redemption and for forgiveness. So long story is, David sees it. He knows that he actually asked her, "Did Joab put you up to this?" And she and she admits the truth that he did. And finally, the king tells, okay, I will allow you, Joab, to go and bring back Absalom. And so Joab does this. He goes up to Geshur and he brings Absalom to Jerusalem, but the king does not see him, he's not allowed in his house, and he can't see my face. He can come back home to Jerusalem and I can know where he is, that he's safe, but he can't come. So there's not forgiveness exactly, but the process has begun. This only intensifies Absalom's hatred for his father and resentment for his father. It's now 7 years of time since the rape of Absalom's sister Tamar, and there is still much rebellion and hatred, which has not dissipated at all in Absalom's heart. So he's residing in Jerusalem, and he never saw the king. This is the end of chapter 14. And he is blaming Joab, and Joab won't come to him either. So Absalom has his servants burn Joab's field. Finally, the king does see Absalom, rather. The king, David, does actually see Absalom. He kissed him, but there is no welcoming. It's almost just mutual. We have to both stay in Jerusalem. Let's try to get just exist, but there was no welcoming when David summoned Absalom. It says in chapter 15, that Absalom after this got his chariots and men, and he went down to Hebron, his birthplace, and he also, while he was still in Jerusalem and before he went to Hebron, he sat at the city gate and he began to gain favor with the people. This seems to be a plan that Absalom began in his own thinking, that if he could get the people to love him more than David, then he would be able to get David to leave the throne, and he could take over the kingdom and move on with his plan. It says in chapter 15, verse 6, Absalom did all this, and the Israelites who came to the king for a settlement, they didn't get anything from King David, but Absalom stole their hearts because he spent time with the people, and you can see that he is working his way in. We begin in verse 7 of chapter 15, that it says, 4 years have passed, and Absalom says to the king, to King David, I want to fulfill a vow that I made to the Lord, and he wants to go to Hebron. It's now about maybe 979, 978. If you stop and think, David is about 61 years old. Absalom is now about 28 years old. Solomon is probably about 13 years old. Absalom has been the crown prince for the kingdom now for about 10 years. And he is apparently restless and not willing to wait any longer, and he, because of the hatred of his father, does not want to have to wait, and so he plots a coup. And this is the unfolding of the coup that begins to make itself known to everybody in Israel. And it literally is to usurp the crown. He's going to take the crown, and run the kingdom, take it away from David. And we read that solemn portion that in verse 10, Absalom sent agents throughout the tribes of Israel with this message: when you hear the sound of the ram's horn, you are to say, Absalom has become king in Hebron. And now the people who have felt kindness and good heart toward Absalom are beginning to wonder if maybe David is not a good king. And you can see how the sword or the violence that has entered in the household in terms of hatred and so forth is beginning to take hold, not only just in the household of David, but in Israel as well. And we see that 200 men from Jerusalem went with Absalom, and they had been invited. They were going innocently, for they didn't know the whole situation. So that's what happens when false teachers or false leaders or false people take over and win the hearts of people, because people often are gullible and are easily led astray. And that's certainly a little nugget of a lesson tucked in here in these verses. People are led by their feelings toward a leader, a pastor, whoever in their lives that has that role. We see that while there was an offering of sacrifices, Absalom sent for David's advisor, Ahithophel. Now, this is an introducing of another person in our list here. Now, Ahithophel is the grandfather of Bathsheba, and he knows exactly what happened between David and Bathsheba, and he hates David because of what he had done with Bathsheba. Now, Ahithophel was probably one of David's mighty men. He was the father of Eliam, who was the father of Bathsheba. And so there had been a lifelong relationship between Ahithophel and David that has now gone sour because of the events that happened with Bathsheba, his granddaughter. So we find that Ahithophel is going to now side with Absalom against David. And when that conspiracy grew so strong and the people supporting Absalom continued to increase, it came to David's attention through, it says, an informer, that the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. David understands, I'm sure, somewhere deep inside of him, that this is part of the consequence. He remembers what he was told by Nathan that would unfold in his house, his household, and he must have understood that this is part of the consequences that he was going to have to bear because of his own sin. But he sees now that Israel has given the kingdom to Absalom in sort of a way, it's taken it away from David. This kingdom had been given to David by God. Absalom is going to try to take it away. But David, because he loves the people of Israel, because he loves his own children, because he is sort of feeling the indictment and the judgment in his own heart, I guess. All of these things must be in his mind. He sees that the threat is real and that it is possible that there's enough hatred in Absalom's heart to kill him. So he gets everyone in the family, in the household of the king, who were not just in one place, but were probably in a very close area in Jerusalem. he says, we have to flee. This is verse 14. Get up, we have to flee, or we will not escape from Absalom. Leave quickly, or he will overtake us and heap disaster on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. So in order to spare the household of David and the people of Israel and the people of Jerusalem from war, civil war essentially, or a coup, he chooses to flee, run away from the danger. Perhaps there's nothing else to be done at this point. He does, it says, leave 10 of his concubines to keep the palace, the day-to-day things, to make sure things are okay and settled inside the palace. There were probably still some servants there, very few, but he wanted to make sure things were taken care of at the palace. And it lists all the people then who joined with David along with his household. He had loyal people who were not even from Israel. These were people of Gath. That would be the Philistines. And we have all these people listed, and we begin to see that he is assembling everyone together, and they prepare to leave the city by the east gate and will cross the valley of Kidron and go on to the Mount of Olives. This was a as it says, people were weeping as all the people in the countryside were weeping loudly while all the people were marching out of the city. This would have been a large number of people and a lot of activities, so people would have seen that this was happening. And people were watching. The king was crossing the Kidron Valley. And Zadok, who was the priest at that time, and all the Levites were carrying the Ark of the Covenant with them as the people left. But the king, and this is an important thing, the king said, no, Zadok, return back to Jerusalem with the Ark of God to the city. Go back to Jerusalem. And he says, if I find favor with the Lord, he will bring me back and allow me to see it, both it and his dwelling place. But if he doesn't, then that's the way it'll be. But I am not going to use the ark in the way that it had been before, as sort of something magical or something that's just for me. The ark belongs in the city of God. It is not mine. So you take it back, and that's an important thing. We are introduced also to Zadok's son and Abiathar's son, Ahimaaz, I guess, and Jonathan. We see them. And then verse 28 of chapter 15, remember, I'll wait at the fords of the wilderness until the word comes from you to inform me. So David had set up a lifeline of communication between his band of people that were fleeing Jerusalem and the people who would stay behind in Jerusalem, because he would need to know what was going on and how things were going and what was going to happen, so he could prepare for it and begin to deal with it. But we see, and I think that it was around this time that Psalms 40, which we also looked at this week in our readings, when Psalm 40 was written, and the time that was on David's heart was spelled out in this psalm. He perhaps had started this Psalm 40 at another time, because it's clearly in two parts. There seems to be a time when he refers to a pit or the wilderness experience at a time before, and he recognized that the Lord had taken him out of that pit and protected him and carried him, and he's relying on that experience to help him with this time that he was going through. But look at chapter 15, verse 30. Because this is such a sad thing, but it really tells the story of who David is and what was in his heart when he enters this wilderness experience, this pit, this terrible experience that he's having to go through. His kingdom has been taken away from him. He is under threat. His children are under threat, and that threat is coming from his own son. So it says in verse 30, David was climbing the slope of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he ascended, his head covered, and he was walking barefoot. As much humility as possibly would happen, he was literally broken, and the experience was overwhelming. And it says all the people with him were the same. They covered up and went and wept as they ascended. I wrote out some of the thoughts about the pit that is described in Psalm 40. I think this has been given to us as our instruction. Very important for us to understand that God has given us instruction of how to deal with everything that comes into our lives. As David is fleeing the city, we are and is climbing the Mount of Olives, weeping, barefoot, broken and bowed. He gets a report that Ahithophel, his trusted advisor from before, a man he has known for many years, since back when Saul was hunting him. This is a long time, fast relationship, and he knows that Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather, and Bathsheba's father's was his son. He knows all of this, and he finds that Ahithophel is a conspirator with Absalom. And he writes, we have recorded here in the rest of verse 31, the Lord, David pleaded, when he hears this, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. It is controversial. It's not widely accepted. Well, it is widely accepted, but it's not totally accepted that Psalm 55 was written to deal with this, because in Psalm 55, which is in our reading as well this week, this whole psalm is trusting God against the treacherous enemy. He outlines them, but verses 12 through 14 really describe Ahithophel and what it meant to him. He said, it's not an enemy who insults me, or I could bear it. It's not a foe who raises up against me, or I could hide from him. But it is you, a man who is my peer, my companion, and good friend. We used to have close fellowship. We walked with the crowd into the house of God. That really is thought to describe David's feelings at this time. It is, and the struggle continues. This consequence that is unfolding in David's life is becoming now overwhelming, and he finds himself in the bottom of this slimy, sticky, muddy pit of the consequence of his own life, and is also describing now that there are consequences in other people's lives because of the choices they're going to make. So we move on and we begin to see all the people who come into contact with David as he's running. And I put a little map for you on the handout in the lessons from the wilderness, because it describes sort of the end of it, but it describes the trip that David took, and all along this trip he encounters people that are put into his life. I think it's an interesting thing to note who was put in and what they did, and the fact that when we're in the pit or when we're in the wilderness, good people are going to come into our lives that are helpful and sent there to help us, and they're going to be deceitful people who are wolves in sheep's clothing, who are greedy, or who are manipulative, or who can't be trusted. So it's not an easy thing to know what to do and how to get through. Ziba will turn out to be sort of a greedy, deceitful person, and he's going to use this situation to take Mephibosheth's inheritance. Mephibosheth we read about earlier, of course. And then Shimei, son of Gera, he's the guy who insults David as he's walking. He curses the king. He expresses hatred. Abishai is willing to kill him, and David said, no, he curses me this way because the Lord told him to curse David. So insight has been given to David to not lash out and not try to defend himself, but let this thing happen and let it unfold as God would have it. But Shimei did curse David and threw stones at him and kicked up dust. We also get a whiff of the fact that Absalom, back in Jerusalem, Absalom is getting information from Ahithophel, and we are told that Ahithophel is giving advice to Absalom to actually quickly go out and do the decision of killing your father quickly. But Ahithophel knows David so well because he spent many years with him, and he's going to tell him, when all Israel, the end of chapter 16, when all Israel hears that you have become repulsive to your father, everyone with you will be encouraged. So Ahithophel says, take your father's concubines, which had been left back at the palace, and rape them. Essentially, go and rape them, and do it on the roof in front of everybody. So this is another way that the consequences told by the judgment told by Nathan to David are going to happen. The destruction of the people of David's life is going to be done out in the open, and that is written there in chapter 6, end of chapter 16. Then we're introduced to Hushai. And Hushai ends up being the opposite of Ahithophel. Hushai is now going to be an advisor, but a spy on behalf of David in the city of Jerusalem, so that they are going to set up a network, which is described here in chapter 15, set up a network of how to get information from Jerusalem about what Absalom is doing and what he's up to and what the plans seem to be to David, so that David can prepare and protect himself and his family. So that network is set up through Hushai, and he uses Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who are the sons of the priest, to do this. And we see the story of the servant girl, another positive picture of how the Lord provides through unlikely people, with the picture of the man and his wife in the courtyard, how they're we find that the servant girl would inform. They would turn him in to inform the king. And let's move on through, because we're running out of time here. But David is kept informed. He is protected, and even those who are the informants, the spies, have been given protection. Lots and lots of provision. That is the picture we need to see. God takes care of his own even while they're in the pit, even while we're in the wilderness, even while we're dealing with the consequences of our own choices, and we're reaping what we have sown. God is taking care of us. He's making provision. He's putting people and resources into our lives to help us through. So we see another group of 3 men. They're now all the way up to Mahanaim, which is a refuge city on the east side of the Jordan, far enough away from Jerusalem that is somewhat a way to protect, and a place that he can regroup, David can regroup and get provision to take care of this rather large group of people. There were at least 600 soldiers, and an unknown number of people from the household. It would have included Solomon and Bathsheba and the other wives and children. So it was a large number of people, and they would have to be fed and sheltered. And God sends 3 men with donkeys laden with all sorts of provisions. And it even lists what they brought: beds and basins and pottery and wheat and barley and roasted grains and all of this stuff. And so every evidence that God is with him, even though he's in the valley of despair, in the wilderness of consequence, in the pit, all of those things are clear in these passages. We then see that Absalom is now has now arranged for and has mounted a force and has made a plan. He knows now where David is, and he goes to prepare an actual battle. This would be a battle between David and his household and the crown prince, Absalom, and his troops. The troops who are from the nation of Israel, all the tribes of Israel. And it says that David arranged all of his troops and divided them into thirds. And we see that David is still a very skilled leader or general of forces, and he has given direction to 3 groups to have them divided into thirds, and they are arranging to defend themselves against what is called Israel's army, which means there were a large number of people from all the tribes of Israel who are arrayed. And we read in chapter 18, verse 6, or verse 7. Or let's begin with verse 6. Then David's forces marched into the field to engage Israel in battle. David is fighting his own people, the people of his own kingdom, which is so sad. And it describes it took place in the forest of Ephraim. And that is not clear exactly where that was, but it was somewhere between Mahanaim and the Jordan River. They were on the east side of the Jordan River, likely. So it says here that Israel's army was defeated by David's soldiers, and the slaughter there was vast. 20,000 people of Israel, men of Israel, soldiers, were dead. And it said the battle spread over the entire area that day, and the forest claimed more people than the sword. And then we have this, it's sort of funny, but it's tragic. Because in the thick of this battle, because it says the forest claimed more people, so they were fighting in a very thick forest, and that's very difficult. That's guerrilla warfare. That's not out in the open. And it says the forest claimed more than it did. Well, one of the ones it claimed was Absalom. And I read a sermon, but I actually can't remember who it is because it was some time ago, but the title of the sermon was "And the Mule Walked On." I want to say it was Chuck Swindoll, but I'm not quite sure. But that's essentially what happened. Absalom was riding his mule, and when he happened to meet David's soldiers, and it says he was riding under the tangled branches of a large oak tree. And remember that hair that Absalom had that he cut every year? We read that it weighed 5 pounds. He had 5 pounds worth of hair. Well, his hair apparently was quite thick and long at this time, and it caught in the tree, and he was hanging by his hair. And a mule that was under him just kept walking on, and he suspended. And one of the men saw him and came and told Joab that he had seen Absalom hanging in an oak tree. And this is where it gets rather grim, and because of a number of things. But Joab said, well, why didn't you kill him? Abishai was the one of the leaders. Joab, Abishai, and Attiah were the leaders, and they were all told that by the king himself, do not kill Absalom. Please bring him back to me. Even though you're in battle, please protect him. And everyone heard that. They knew that that was the order of the king. But Joab was now going to go against that order directly. And he himself kills Absalom. It may have been the thing that had to be done. Absalom was absolutely wrong in mounting a coup against the kingdom. And Joab may have had to do the thing that David couldn't do, but he should not have gone against the king, because that is also wrong. I don't know that we can make a judgment here. God will make that judgment, but we do read that Joab killed him. And then we have two men who are described as willing to run all the way back to Mahanaim, where David was, and tell the news that the battle would now be over because Absalom was dead. But we see the story that Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run. And Joab said, no, you won't tell the right story. You won't tell the truth. I'm going to send a Cushite. That would be a man from Ethiopia. Cush is Ethiopia, so this would be an Ethiopian man. Go and tell, I want you to go and tell the king what you have seen. So both men run. Apparent it is apparent that the people on the wall saw Ahimaaz run, and he outran the Cushite, and he arrived first, and he tells David, the first runner says, we're now in chapter 18, in verse 28, Ahimaaz calls out to the king, all is well, blessed be the Lord your God. He delivered up the men who rebelled against my lord the king. And David, of course, only wants to know, is Absalom all right? And Ahimaaz lies. Said, I saw a big disturbance, but I don't know what it was around Joab. And they see another runner coming, and it's the Ethiopian or the Cushite, and the Cushite says, when asked the same question, he said, I wish that the enemies of my lord the king, along with all who rise up against you with evil intent, would become like that young man. He had no loyalty to Absalom. He only saw him as someone opposing the king. So since Absalom was dead, he wanted everyone to be on that opposite side of David, wanted everyone to be dead. And of course, the king realizes that Absalom has been killed. And it says deeply moved here, but the Hebrew says he shuddered and trembled. That's David. The king just shuddered and trembled, because now this is the third son required of David. It must have been an overwhelming sorrow, because he weeps and weeps and weeps. And we have a whole psalm written about Absalom that we have read. The grief of Absalom was really more the grief of guilt, and for dealing with the sorrow of his own consequences of his own sin. And it was actually debilitating. It actually could be described as almost unreasonable guilt. It, of course, when the king is in that state, the whole kingdom suffers. And we go on to read in chapter 19 as we try to finish up as much as we can of the story. The king is continuing to weep and mourn over Absalom, and Joab again says, we've got to get some control in this city and in this kingdom. And if you can't get yourself together, and this is Joab speaking to the king, which is quite unheard of, the general speaking to his superior, the king, in this way, he actually confronts him and says, if you can't get yourself together, then everyone in Israel is going to be against you, and and your soldiers are going to turn away from you, because they're going to see that you cannot be a king. You've got to be a king. You've got to start being a king again. That's absolutely important. You can't stay in the pit. You've got to get out of the pit. You've got to make choices to say, I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to move out of this pit. After you've learned the lessons that you need to learn, you have to make the decision to not stay there, to move on. Recognizing that it is the strength of the Lord that gets you. The waiting in the pit is the way you get your strength. Those that wait on the Lord will mount up with their strength as eagles. And so Joab is correct, and he goes to the king, and the king does go, and he goes back to the city gate, and all the people were told, look, the king is sitting at the city gate. So Things are beginning to look like we're getting over thing, and the worst of it seems to be a little bit behind him. We see that the Israelites who had arrayed against themselves against David ran away because they were afraid that David might take revenge against them for fighting against him on the side of Absalom. And so we see that he sent word to the priest Zadok and say to the elders of Judah, "Why should you be the last to restore the king to his palace? You are my brothers, my flesh and blood. So why should you be the last to restore the king?" And so he says, "Aren't you my flesh and blood? May God punish me and do so severely if you don't become my commander." He makes Amasa the commander, who will be over Joab now or replace Joab. But it says the king apparently got himself together. He won over Judah and began to work on renewing with Israel. And it says he returned and arrived, and he crossed the Jordan River. He's coming from Mahanaim, of course. He has to cross and go back into Jerusalem and assume his role as king. And it says in the end of chapter 19, verse 41, "Suddenly all the men of Israel came to the king." And why did your brothers, the men of Judah, take you away secretly and transport the king and his household across the Jordan along with David's men? And it says, because the king is our relative. Why does this make you angry? Have we ever eaten anything of the king or been honored at all? And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, "We have 10 shares." And so there's still some strife between Israel and Judah. Israel thought, the other tribes of Israel besides Judah thought that Judah was usurping authority over all the other tribes, and they didn't want that to happen. We can see the seeds of mistrust between 10 tribes and 2 tribes, Benjamin eventually and Judah, begin here. And we see that civil war breaks out because of this. I think this is what Joab was trying to avoid. And David didn't handle it as well, perhaps, as it could have been. He did try to get himself together. He did try to decide to be king again, but he was not as effective, perhaps, as he should have been. And he didn't send the messages to the rest of the tribes that should have been sent at this time. And we have a civil war breakout because of a Benjamite named Sheba. And so it says in chapter 20, verse 2, "So all the men of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba." And here we go again. More problems, not just in the household of David himself, but in the kingdom itself. The kingdom is at risk of falling. Here we see that Joab's feeling of betrayal by David and being replaced by Amasa, I guess it is. He kills Amasa, and then he pursues this fella Sheba to try and get rid of him and stop the civil war and get this over and return the kingdom to David and get things back on shape. You can see how this is spiraled out of control. Oh, how terrible it is, this wilderness of consequence and destruction and the pit of despair. But we have another little blessing, I guess, that comes in the woman of Abel. Another interesting character is introduced to us in the woman of Abel. She is a leader among her people in the city of Abel. It's a fairly large area, and it seems to be sort of a hub of a number of little villages that surround it, but it must be a walled city, and the people who live there have a council, and she happens to have some sway in that council. And she seeks to talk to Joab and see if she can stop the carnage that's going on, because Sheba has run inside the wall of this city of Abel, and he's hiding in there, and Joab is going to destroy everything just to get to Sheba. And the woman of Abel, we don't know her name, but this woman is saying, I'm one of the peaceful and faithful of Israel, but you're trying to destroy a city that is like a mother in Israel. This is chapter 20, verse 19. And he said, why would you devour the Lord's inheritance? And Joab says, I'm not interested in killing all these people. I just want Sheba. And so she said, well, look for it. I'm going to deliver its head over the wall. And presently, that's what happened. And we come sort of to the end of all of this turmoil. And at the end of chapter 20, and we're out of time, we've got to be finished here. But at the end of this time, we come to, it says that Joseph returned to the king in Jerusalem, and it looks like things are going to settle down. And chapter 21 through 23 is really a different time, and it's a very important and interesting story, but we're not going to be able to go through it now. But it seems to follow a few verses in the end of chapter 20, which I'd like for you to take note of, because this was a way of saying the disruption in the kingdom has been managed. It has now been returned to the king, and he is now the king of the kingdom of all of Israel. And we see that when we read these verses 23 through 26. And I want to remind you that we read the same thing, same kind of a way in chapter 8, verses 15 through 18, when the kingdom had been established by David, and all of Israel was under the kingship, and Jerusalem was the capital of all of Israel. And David had set up his government. And it describes the people who were over the government in chapter 8, 15 through 18. And it's similar to this statement in chapter 20. We are back to Joab being over the whole army of Israel, not just of Judah. We have Benaiah over the king's guard, if you will. This would be the palace guard, people whose job it was to keep the things of the king, the household, all of the things of the king safe. We have now a new one that's not in chapter 8. Adoram was over forced labor. This would be over the people seized as prisoners or slaves following a battle. These would likely be non-Jews, but it could have included some Jews. But the forced labor, that's a new role that was not there in chapter 8. We have Jehoshaphat, who was in chapter 8 as a recorder. That would be someone who keeps the history. That's why we have these books and these chapters to read. because someone like Jehoshaphat kept a record. We have a new role, another new role. Well, it's not actually a new role, but it's just described differently. We have a new person in the role of scribe or secretary. And then we have Zadok, who is also in chapter 8, and Abiathar, who were priests. And then we have a priest who is like a chaplain to David. That's in chapter 20. But back in chapter 8, the last of the group in chapter 8 that were over the kingdom were David's sons. We now find that that is missing. David's sons are no longer seen as ministers over areas in the government. So I think it's kind of interesting to see that there are a lot of change that has happened in these 12 or maybe more years that have occurred in these chapters between 13 and the end of 20. 21 through the end of the book tells the story, sort of a sad story, of a woman named Rizpah. And we may be able to get to that another time, but I want to not run over in our time. But I hope that this is an awful lot of stuff, a lot of things going on, and a lot of people, a lot of events. But I hope that we can learn, as David did, the lessons that we have to learn, because each of us will go through wilderness type experiences or being in the pit kinds of experiences. And I think that's why we have recorded these chapters for us and these psalms that were written for us in this way. So I'm going to finish up the recording now. Turn